A raise? You should be grateful we even keep you. Vance Miller laughed. His voice bounced off the cold, hard walls of the executive conference room. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, the blue folder containing my 7th annual performance evaluation lying open in front of me. On paper, my work was flawless. For 7 years, I had received exceptional evaluations from my direct supervisors. For 7 years, I had worked overtime, solved emergency calibration crises in the middle of the night, and ensured that our industrial manufacturing equipment met the most stringent regulatory guidelines. And yet, for 7 years, my base pay had not increased by a single penny. Abigail, your request is simply unreasonable, Clara Davis said. The chief financial officer tilted her head, her face showing a kind of exaggerated sympathy that felt more insulting than Vance's open laughter. She adjusted her reading glasses and smoothed her designer jacket before pointing at a spreadsheet. She told me that considering current global market conditions and the tightening margins in industrial production, asking for a 30% increase was ambitious. The rest of the leadership team sat around the long, polished walnut table, exchanging knowing glances. There were 8 executives in the room, and collectively, they held the power to decide the value of my career. They knew the cost of every raw material, the price of shipping containers, and the company's net profits, but they knew absolutely nothing about what I actually did on the production floor. I leaned forward, keeping my hands flat on the table, and kept my voice calm. I pointed out that the calibration method I had developed during my 2nd year at the company had increased our testing precision by 37%. That single technical breakthrough cut calibration time on our primary assembly lines in half, from 6 hours down to just under 3. I added that the Eastbrook contract, which had been the backbone of our division's revenue for the past 3 years, was secured because my calibration specifications met their extreme tolerance requirements. Our competitors had repeatedly failed to meet those specifications, and my method was the only reason we kept that contract active. Brad, the vice president of sales, interrupted me. He waved his hand dismissively and claimed that the Eastbrook deal was won through aggressive sales negotiation tactics and corporate networking. We both knew the truth, but arguing with Brad in front of the others was useless. I calmly reminded the table that I had trained 16 junior technicians since I started, and that I had personally written the troubleshooting manual that kept our aerospace division operational. I had spent 6 weeks redesigning components and revising testing protocols during our European regulatory crisis, working through weekends to ensure our exports passed customs. Without that effort, our European expansion would have collapsed entirely, costing the company millions of dollars in fines and canceled orders. I had worked through holidays and stayed past midnight for weeks, sacrificing my own personal time to clean up the mess left by our poorly trained field engineers. Vance Miller, our vice president of operations, drummed his fingers on the table and cut in. He called it a team effort and insisted that everyone pulls their weight at Apex Manufacturing Specialists. I looked him dead in the eye and noted that while everyone pulled their weight, my salary had remained exactly the same since the day I was hired. I was only asking to align my compensation with current industry standards. Vance leaned back in his chair, sharing an amused smile with Clara. He told me that industry standards are for average contributors, and that if I wanted extraordinary compensation, I needed to show extraordinary results. He claimed that the company's success was driven by strategic leadership, not by technical routine. My chest tightened, but I kept my breathing steady. The calibration breakthrough I had pioneered had generated millions of dollars in increased efficiency and reduced waste. Last quarter's confidential financial report, which I had reviewed because of my compliance oversight role, attributed a 28% profit increase directly to my technical innovations. The numbers spoke for themselves. Yet Vance didn't even bother to look at the market research documents I had carefully prepared. He simply pushed the folders back across the table toward me. He repeated that I should be grateful they kept me, his voice dripping with condescension. The entire leadership team nodded in agreement, wrapping up the meeting as if the matter were settled. They began collecting their tablets and folders. already talking about their weekend golf plans and the upcoming board meeting. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or show frustration. I had spent 7 years hoping that my dedication and quality of work would eventually speak for itself. But in that single moment, I realized the truth. They would never value me because they assumed my loyalty was unconditional. I simply stood up, closed the blue folder, and pulled a plain white envelope from my jacket pocket. I placed the envelope quietly in the center of the polished table, looked at Vance, and told him thank you for your time. Then, I walked out of the room, leaving them to their congratulations. 3 days later, when they finally opened that envelope and saw exactly where I was going, their frantic phone calls began flooding mine. But by then I was already gone, and the wheels of a major industry shift were already turning. The plain white envelope remained on the corner of Vance Miller's desk for 3 full days. I knew this because Jason, a senior calibration engineer who sat near the executive offices, told me that Vance had tossed it onto his pile of unread mail without a second glance. To Vance, the envelope was probably just a formal complaint or a request for a follow-up meeting, something he could address whenever he found the time. He had no idea that inside that envelope was my official resignation letter. I had written 2 paragraphs, keeping the tone professional and concise. I made no accusations, mentioned no grievances, and simply stated that I would be departing the company in 2 weeks to pursue another opportunity. I promised to ensure all my current projects were transitioned properly and that my documentation would be complete. As I worked at my station during those 3 days, I thought about the 7 years of my life I had given to Apex Manufacturing Specialists. I had joined the company fresh out of college, eager to apply my engineering degree to real-world challenges. The company manufactured high-precision industrial equipment, the kind of machinery where a deviation of a single micrometer could lead to catastrophic failure. My nickname in college had been Precision Abby, and I brought that same obsession with detail to the production lines at Apex. I spent my first 2 years learning every detail of our machinery, understanding the physical limitations of our sensors, and realizing that our standard calibration protocols were built on outdated assumptions. I spent my weekends experimenting with alternative calibration methods, using my own money to purchase testing equipment from local suppliers. My relationship with Liam, my partner of 4 years, had ended during my 5th year at the company. We had planned a trip to celebrate his sister's wedding in Michigan, but a major shipment of our medical testing equipment had failed inspection in Germany. The European expansion was in jeopardy, and Vance had called an emergency meeting, telling me that either I fixed the regulatory issues or they would find someone who could. I canceled the trip, spent 6 consecutive weekends in the lab redesigning the sensor housings, and missed the wedding. Liam left 3 months later, telling me that I was married to a company that didn't even know my name. He was right. I was sacrifice after sacrifice, and the company took it all as if it were their birthright. Despite my sacrifice, my achievements were routinely absorbed into the company's general successes. When my new calibration method was implemented, reducing testing times by half and eliminating customer complaints, the company celebrated by presenting the technique as our new proprietary corporate protocol. My name was never mentioned in the announcements or the newsletters. Vance accepted a major bonus from the board of directors for operational efficiency, while I received a certificate of appreciation printed on cardstock. I watched them take my calculations, my testing methodologies, and my experimental data and brand them all with the corporate logo, completely erasing the hours I had spent in the lab. It was a disheartening experience, but it taught me that in this organization, the people who did the work were secondary to the people who claimed the credit. I watched junior engineers, mostly young men who had been hired years after me, negotiate starting salaries that were 30% higher than my current pay. Whenever I questioned human resources, Hazel, our department representative, would offer vague explanations about internal equity and market constraints. She told me that adjusting salaries for established employees was difficult and could disrupt the balance of the department. They wanted me to be a team player while they treated me like an expense. So, I stopped asking. I realized that my loyalty was being treated as a weakness and that they would never pay me what I was worth because they assumed I would never leave. I began responding to inquiries from recruiters. My work in calibration precision had gained a quiet reputation in the industry, and it didn't take long for the offers to arrive. I turned down 3 high-paying corporate positions because I wanted something different, something that would allow me to change the industry rather than just change my employer. The breakthrough came when I received an email from Evelyn, the director of the Industrial Standards Association. The association was the primary regulatory body that established precision guidelines for our entire sector. Their certification was mandatory for any manufacturer wanting to sell equipment to aerospace or medical clients. Evelyn wrote that they had been tracking the precision improvements in our sector and had identified my calibration protocols as the driver behind those standards. She offered me a position as the Chief Innovation Officer, a role that would give me the authority to rewrite the certification guidelines for the entire industry. The compensation package was double my current salary, but more importantly, it offered the resources to enforce real quality standards across the market. I met with Evelyn for dinner, intending only to ask questions, but by the time the check arrived, I knew I had found my path forward. I told her I needed 2 weeks to transition my work at Apex, and she agreed, telling me they had waited years for someone with my expertise. Now, 3 days after placing my resignation on the table, the silence from the executive offices was about to end. On the 3rd afternoon after my review, my phone began vibrating continuously on my desk. I looked at the screen and saw a sequence of missed calls. There were 6 from Human Resources, 4 from Vance Miller, and 2 from Clara Davis. I ignored them all, finished the calibration report I was writing, and walked to the break room to get a cup of tea. When I returned to my desk, Hazel from Human Resources was waiting for me. Her face was flushed, and her usual professional smile was completely missing. She whispered that Vance had finally opened my envelope and that he wanted to see me in the executive conference room immediately. She seemed nervous, as if she knew that the balance of power had shifted. I followed her down the hall, feeling a strange sense of calm. When I entered the room, Vance and Clara were already seated at the table. My resignation letter lay between them, looking small on the polished wood. Vance pushed the paper toward me and asked what this was. I sat down and told him it was my 2 weeks' notice, as the letter clearly stated. Clara leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent, and asked where I was going. I told her that I preferred not to share that information until I began my new role. I could see the panic in her eyes. She knew that without my technical oversight, the division would struggle to maintain compliance. She tried to probe further, asking if a competitor had made me a better offer, but I simply remained silent, refusing to give her the satisfaction of an answer. Vance's demeanor had changed completely from our last meeting. The laughter was gone, replaced by a desperate intensity. He told me that they might have been hasty during my evaluation and that they were willing to revisit my compensation request. Hazel added that the leadership team was dealing with a lot of pressure during the review period and that they valued my contributions tremendously. I thanked them, but told them I had already accepted another offer. Clara immediately offered to match the salary, asking me to name my price. They went from claiming I was average to offering me whatever I wanted in a matter of days. I explained that I had made my decision and that it was final, prompting Vance to lean back with a tightened jaw, his face displaying a mix of anger and defeat that he tried to hide behind a cold stare. I looked at the 3 of them, realizing that they still didn't understand. They thought this was a negotiation tactic, a game of leverage. They had no concept of the frustration of working for 7 years under leadership that only saw me as a line item on an expense sheet. I told them this wasn't about money, though we all knew that money was a reflection of respect. I told them I was looking for an opportunity where I could influence industry standards. Vance offered to create a new title for me, Senior Technical Director, with a team of 4 technicians reporting to me and a 50% raise. I declined the offer, stood up, and told them I would spend my remaining 2 weeks ensuring a smooth transition. During my final 2 weeks, I worked harder than ever. I documented every calibration sequence, wrote detailed guides for our specialized machinery, and recorded video tutorials showing exactly how to adjust the sensors for different environmental conditions. I spent hours sitting with the technicians I had trained, going over every complex procedure and answering their questions. I wanted to make sure they had everything they needed to succeed. I didn't want my departure to hurt the people on the production floor. On my last day, my desk was cleared in less than 10 minutes. I handed my badge to security, feeling the weight of 7 unappreciated years lift from my shoulders. Vance met me in the lobby as I was walking toward the exit. He asked one last time where I was going, suggesting we should stay in touch. I looked at him and told him I was starting as the Chief Innovation Officer at the Industrial Standards Association. His face turned completely pale. He knew, as everyone in manufacturing knew, that the association's audits determined which companies survived and which went under. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. He asked if we could talk about this privately. I told him we had 7 years to talk, wished him luck, and walked out into the afternoon sun. I spent the next 3 weeks visiting my parents in Michigan, hiking the trails I had been too busy to explore, and ignoring 14 calls from Vance's personal number. I stayed in a small cabin near the lake, enjoying the absolute peace of a quiet morning without alarms or corporate emails. It was the first time in 7 years that I had slept past 6 in the morning, and the quiet was exactly what I needed to clear my head and prepare for the next chapter of my career. My parents were thrilled to have me back, and we spent the evening sitting on the porch, talking about everything other than industrial calibration. They were incredibly supportive, reminding me that my skills had always been valuable and that it was about time a company recognized it. My first 3 weeks at the Industrial Standards Association were spent in a quiet office with windows that looked out over a green park. It was a stark contrast to the noisy, windowless testing labs at Apex. Evelyn gave me complete freedom to review our current certification guidelines. I discovered that the precision standards had not been updated in nearly a decade, allowing companies to use outdated equipment and ignore calibration drift to save on operational costs. I spent my first month drafting a comprehensive revision of the guidelines, raising the precision requirements to align with modern manufacturing capabilities. I wanted to ensure that companies could no longer take shortcuts at the expense of safety. I added strict requirements for documentation, ensuring that every calibration sequence was tracked in a central registry. This registry would prevent manufacturers from backdating inspections or using fabricated data to pass audits, a practice that I knew was all too common in companies looking to cut corners. When the new standards were officially published, the reaction from the manufacturing sector was immediate. The phone lines at the association were flooded with calls from worried executives. My former colleague Jason called my direct line, his voice filled with anxiety. He asked if I had seen the new standards, calling the calibration requirements impossible to meet. I told him they were not impossible, reminding him that I had implemented those exact protocols at Apex 3 years ago, but the leadership team had rejected them because they wanted to save money on sensor upgrades. He sighed and admitted that the company was nowhere near compliant for their upcoming renewal and that they had already spent thousands of dollars on temporary fixes that did not work. 2 weeks later, Apex manufacturing specialists submitted an urgent request for a pre-assessment review. They were concerned about their upcoming certification audit, which was scheduled for the following month. Because of my prior relationship with the company, I recused myself from the audit and assigned the review to Zachary, our senior technical director. The pre-assessment report arrived on my desk a week later, flagged with a red warning label. Apex had failed the review in every category. Their calibration procedures were outdated, their equipment showed significant measurement drift, and their quality documentation was completely inadequate. 3 days later, Vance Miller called my office. He didn't bother with a greeting and demanded to know why I was targeting his company. He claimed that the new standards were designed specifically to punish Apex for not giving me a raise. I kept my voice flat and professional, reminding him that the standards applied to all manufacturers in the sector, and that many of our competitors were already in compliance. I added that all certification discussions were recorded for quality assurance. He cursed under his breath and hung up. He was still trying to blame others for his own regulatory failures. A week later, Jason requested a private meeting outside the office. We met at a quiet diner near the edge of the city on a rainy Tuesday evening. He looked nervous, sipping his coffee and glancing toward the door before leaning across the table. He told me that Vance and Clara were preparing a formal complaint to the Industry Oversight Board. They were alleging that I had a clear conflict of interest and that I had deliberately sabotaged the calibration documentation at Apex before leaving, making it impossible for them to comply with the new standards. They were trying to shift the blame to protect their positions and avoid losing the Eastbrook contract. I took a slow sip of my tea, looking at him. I asked if they really thought that would work. Jason nodded, telling me they were desperate because the Eastbrook contract was up for renewal and they could not secure it without our certification. I looked at Jason and told him that they could file whatever they wanted. I explained that under the Federal Defense Trade Secrets Act, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 1833B, I was protected by absolute whistleblower immunity. The statute clearly states that an individual shall not be held criminally or civilly liable under any federal or state trade secret law for the disclosure of a trade secret that is made in confidence to a government or regulatory official solely for the purpose of reporting a suspected violation of law. I had documented their systemic practice of extending calibration intervals beyond safe limits, which compromised equipment precision. I had disclosed these safety violations to the association in my official capacity to protect the public interest. Their claims of sabotage and theft were legally void, and their attempt to use my transition documents against me would only expose their own negligence. Jason listened in silence, his eyes wide, as he realized that Vance's plan was already dead. He admitted that Vance had been bragging about how this complaint would destroy my reputation and force the association to back down on the audit. He thanked me for the warning, paid for the coffee, and left the diner looking much more relieved than when he had arrived. I walked back to my car in the rain, knowing that the next few weeks would be chaotic, but feeling completely prepared for the storm they were about to bring upon themselves. The formal complaint hearing took place 6 weeks later at the Industrial Standards Association headquarters. Vance Miller arrived with 3 corporate attorneys and 2 external consultants, looking confident as he took his seat across from the audit board. I sat next to Evelyn and our legal counsel in the high-ceilinged conference room, keeping my face expressionless. Vance began his presentation by claiming that the new standards were punitive and targeted, and that my presence at the association represented a conflict of interest. He then accused me of withholding critical calibration data when I resigned, which he claimed had directly caused their recent audit failures. When he finished, the board chair turned to Zachary, our technical director. Zachary pulled a thick binder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. He explained that the ethics committee had conducted a thorough investigation into the allegations. He stated that the committee had reviewed the transition package I had provided to Apex. The package contained exactly 2,347 pages of detailed technical documentation, along with 126 recorded training videos covering every calibration sequence. Zachary added that this transition package exceeded typical industry standards by more than 300%. He pointed out that the calibration sequences Vance claimed were missing were actually fully documented in Section 12.3 of the manual I had left. Vance's lead attorney leaned over to whisper in his ear, his expression turning grim. The board chair then revealed that during the investigation, they had discovered that Apex's internal IT systems had deliberately moved my transition folders to an archive directory that was inaccessible to the technicians, attempting to create the appearance of sabotage to support their complaint. Furthermore, the Industry Oversight Board had initiated a separate investigation under Securities Exchange Act, Rule 10b-5. Looking into potential securities fraud related to misleading statements Apex had made to investors regarding their proprietary calibration technologies. They had claimed sole ownership of innovations that were actually my uncredited work, using my developments to artificially inflate their stock price. The hearing ended 20 minutes later. The board voted unanimously to dismiss Apex's complaint and place the company on provisional certification status, requiring audits every 30 days. Within a week, the Apex Board of Directors suspended Vance Miller and Clara Davis, pending an internal investigation. Their stock price dropped 60% in 10 days, and Eastbrook officially terminated their contract, citing a failure to maintain quality standards. The board chair and executive committee realized that they had been misled by Vance's reports for years. A month later, Clara Davis came to my office. She looked tired, her executive confidence completely shattered, wearing a simple wool coat instead of her usual designer suits. She told me that the company was on the verge of bankruptcy and that 400 employees would lose their jobs if they could not regain full certification. She offered to settle, promising to issue a public apology, pay me the back wages I was owed, and name the calibration protocol after me if I would help them pass the audit. I looked at her and told her that I could not consult for certified companies, as that would be a real conflict of interest. But I pointed out that the association had recently launched a voluntary attribution framework. The framework required companies to document the history of their technical innovations, giving proper credit and compensation to the original developers. I told her that if Apex adopted this framework and publicly acknowledged the work of their engineers, it would demonstrate a commitment to compliance that the audit board would look upon favorably. Apex adopted the attribution framework 3 weeks later. They issued a public document identifying 26 engineers whose work had been previously claimed as proprietary company methods. My name was at the top of that list, credited with 17 distinct innovations spanning 7 years. Vance and Clara resigned shortly after, and the board appointed a new chief executive officer from the engineering department. The company slowly rebuilt its reputation, eventually passing its audits and securing new clients who valued their commitment to transparency. The transition was difficult for them, but it was necessary to save the company, and it proved that an organization could change its culture if forced to confront the truth. Last month, I presented the final version of the attribution framework at our annual summit in Chicago. More than 60% of the manufacturers in our sector had already adopted it. As I stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd of executives and employees, I saw Jason sitting in the third row, smiling. The revenge was never about destroying Apex. It was about creating an industry where excellence cannot be exploited, where credit cannot be stolen, and where the people who build the technology are finally valued for their work. If you have ever had your achievements overlooked or taken by someone else, remember that quality leaves a trail of evidence that cannot be erased. Stand your ground, document your work, and let the excellence of your achievements tell its own story. In the end, the truth has a way of coming to light, and those who take the shortcuts will eventually find themselves left behind.